So, what is the most interesting part of Web3 that nobody talks about? Somebody sent me a video called Line Goes Up, the problem with NFTs. And I think it was an excellent takedown of everything wrong with Web3 and cryptocurrency and all of that. And in fact, I highly recommend you watch it. I'll drop a link in the description because it was incredibly informative and really made me think about exactly what Web3 is really good for. And as someone who's fascinated by technology, I've been watching this grow, and I think there's a lot of good potential in the Web3 space. But in watching this kind of outsider's view of everything going on in Web3, I had to confront that I didn't have a good answer to a lot of his questions and his problems with everything going on. And so I really had to think about, okay, what is really so fascinating about this? Because I agree with everything he said. I think it really picks up on a lot of the problems in the space. But there's one thing that he never touched on. And more importantly, I've never actually seen anybody touch on this fact. And I'm sure there's some people have. It's highly unlikely that I'm the first person to say this, but I don't know of anyone who's said so yet. The most interesting thing to me is that for the first time in history, people are able to test whole economies and whole governments, right? So what Web3 allows is it gives you the ability to spin up an entire economy and potentially a government. And you know, the combination government plus economy in the form of a DAO is something that won't really start to really be recognized until 5, 10, 15 years down the road. Because what's happening is that having DAOs gives people the ability to actually say, okay, I have an idea for this better governance structure. I have an idea for this better economy, better economic model. And I'm going to spin that up as its own economy. And the problem with that is that when you do that, there's all sorts of different squeezes you can kind of put on the market to maximize different gains. And that's what venture capital is essentially. And so by getting a lot of venture capitalists into the space, they go, oh, well, we can do all sorts of different manipulations to the market. And because of that, line goes up. And that's great. And people are going to make a lot of money off of that. And a lot of people are going to lose a bunch of money. But the part that it doesn't get into, and the part that I think is so interesting, is this ability to test out these different models. And what's going to happen over time is that people are going to start running into the problem. Economists and political science experts have studied for years, right? There's certain aspects of human nature that result in all sorts of different outcomes. And so we're going to see this. But what's also going to be interesting is it gives us the ability to start from a clean slate. And as that's going to happen, what we're going to see is we're going to see more regulations come into place, and we're going to see more of these ideas around what constraints have to be there. But we're not doing it from the standpoint of all the constraints that have currently exist. And so what's going to end up happening is people are going to be able to test out these different governmental models, these different economic models, and these new restrictions are going to come in, but they're not going to have the baggage of these old systems that were implemented for various reasons in history that are no longer a problem. And so we're going to be able to start fresh. And then as we start blending these new models back into existing systems and replacing existing systems, that's going to have a very outsized result, especially as the people who are practicing, you know, these government structures and these economic models and have proven that proven that they can work. These people will then start to end up in positions of power because they've shown that these models work. They can prove this out. So before, where you've got all of these theorists saying, like, I've studied politics throughout centuries and this is exactly how things turn out, or I've studied economics throughout human history and this is how things turn out because of the economy, economists can actually build out whole models and launch them in the world. And if it ends up being a more efficient economy than the existing economy, it should replace the section of the economy that it's meant to replace. But what happens is it's not nearly that smooth, and then there's all these different forces at play. But hopefully what we end up doing is we essentially have people saying, hey, I bet that I can have a more efficient part of this part of the economy, make money through that, and then that just becomes the more efficient part. So yes, all of these cryptocurrencies are terrible in terms of efficiency, but what they allow is actually something quite incredible. And we're going to see, the whole process is going to be optimized. There's going to be a reduction in carbon footprint. There's going to be all sorts of mechanisms in place to allow anybody to be able to use these different governance mechanisms and these various economic mechanisms. But they're actually going to have the ability to launch that economic model out in the wild and try it and see if it works. And, no longer do you have to wait until you get into this big position of power in some large government to be able to enact these policies. You can prove them out on a smaller scale and then allow them to scale on their own. And it turns out if you're actually really good at that, you can make a lot of money doing so. But ultimately, that's what a business is. So a business comes down to finding an inefficiency in the market and solving that inefficiency and then just becoming part of the economy. But it doesn't have the same level of nature as forking the entire economy and saying, if things existed this way, this is how it would play out, because you're actually able to prove out that this is how it will play out. And so if you look closely at the Web3 space and start to see the ideas that are starting to bubble to the surface across communities and across projects and the types of people that are getting involved in this space, what you're going to see is that I have a feeling you're going to see a lot of future politicians, a bunch of future economists, and everything really come up through this ecosystem because it gives people the ability to launch simulated economies at scale and prove that they're more efficient. And in order to have that be a meaningful experiment, there's going to need to be guidelines in place, and these will come over time with regulations and everything. But in the end, it gives people the ability to experiment on things. But all in all, it gives people the ability to experiment on things that previously you'd have to run a larger organization, or you'd have to be part of a country, or, politician, something to that effect, in order to get some of these ideas realized. But now anybody can do it. And of course, anybody can do it. So it means we're going to see a lot of terrible ideas, and people are going to find things that just don't work, and that's actually okay. But what's going to come out of that is ideas and people who are much, much better off for having gone through the process, gone through the experimentation, gone through the learning, and become better leaders who have this experience at a level that used to be reserved for world leaders and people of extreme power. Now, anybody can get that level of experience by just building it up online. And that's such an incredible thing, because it means that our future leaders, the people who have a say in how the world is going to go, are coming out of this space with this experience, with this knowledge, on top of everything that they've been able to get through studying theory and all of that. So it's just going to be this extra level of education, this experimental level as opposed to theoretical. And that, to me, is the most interesting part of Web3.